We have a truly outstanding group of panelists today who will take us on that tour of the world. I'm going to introduce them, mentioning their names very briefly, their bios very briefly. There are far more detailed bios in your speaker program. First, Eike Batista, the chairman and CEO of EBX Group. He has a business portfolio that encompasses oil, energy, logistics, mining, among others. Eike is one of the wealthiest men in the world. He is the wealthiest Brazilian and is by birth the wealthiest German as well. So, on that. Eike's company's invested $15.5 billion in Brazil in 2011 to 2012, creating more than 20,000 jobs. Xi-Qing is the vice chairman and the president of the China Investment Corporation. Mr. Gao is a lawyer by training. He has his JD from the Duke University Law School. He was a regulator. He's the vice chairman of the China Securities Regulatory Commission and of the National Council of the Social Security Fund of China. Today, CIC, the China Investment Corporation, has more than $400 billion in assets under management. It's one of the most important sovereign wealth funds in the world. Scott Minerd, who many of you know, is the Chief Investment Officer and Managing Partner of Guggenheim Partners. He guides the investment strategies of sector portfolio managers, leads a specialized research group focused on relative value shifts and global macroeconomic developments, and he writes truly incisive monthly commentaries on the global economy. Barry Sternlicht, chairman and CEO of Starwood Capital Group, the private investment firm that he started in 1991. For the past 21 years, he has structured investment transactions throughout the world with an asset value exceeding $40 billion. Today, Starwood manages approximately $12 billion of investor capital on behalf of its high net worth and its institutional partners. And finally, Chris Viehbacher, the CEO of Sanofi, a Paris-based pharmaceutical company, the largest in Europe, the second largest in the world in terms of total assets, one of the largest companies in Europe. He also chairs the CEO Roundtable on Cancer, which brings together U.S. employers to develop workplace initiatives that reduce the risk of cancer. He has been a good friend of the Milken Institute and has been a very able partner in the work that we have done in the area of how to create greater innovation in the biopharmaceutical sector. So join me in welcoming our four distinguished guests. Scott, I'm going to start with you, not only because you are a senior officer of our conference underwriter, Guggenheim. That has nothing to do with my starting with him. But also because I think you're extremely well positioned to give us some idea of what you see as the long-term trends in the global economy. And we'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to summarize where the world will be in the next 50 years.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. I think the most important thing at this point is to recognize that there are a handful of macro trends that completely dominate everything else, and we often get distracted with the short-term noise that we see in the markets and in the news. But the first thing to recognize is that we are living through a period of time which will represent one of the greatest wealth transfers in the history of the world. And that is to say that debtors are going to gain at the advantage of creditors as the overextended borrowers in the market have to discharge their debts. And there are only two paths for this to occur. One is painful restructurings and write-offs, or the other is through monetary policy, which would be designed to just reduce the real burden of debt on society through inflation. This plays out in two different ways we're seeing in the world today. We're seeing the attempt in Europe to do austerity, run a very disciplined monetary policy, versus the United States, where growth has become the predominant theme. And that imbalance has led to the fact that the United States has become the locomotive of the world today in terms of pulling the global economy along. Because of this, there are a number of issues that arise in the long term that will make it a challenging environment for the United States in the future. The other thing that's happening in the world is the transformation which is occurring in a number of countries like Eike's and in Xi-Qing's country, where we have a rise of a consumer sector. And as these countries get larger, their dependency upon exports is being reduced, and we're seeing a massive shift to a growth of a middle class in a larger portion of the world. This gradual increase in living standards is going to increase the competition for global resources, such as energy, but yet at the same time, while we're seeing this huge surge in demand for energy occurring over the next 20 to 30 years, we're also being faced with a lot of technological innovation and new discoveries, which could completely change the entire dynamic and makes the whole energy equation, just as one example, a really hard area to predict in the future. But these are, I think, in my mind, Mike, the global themes that are going to dominate everything else that we deal with.
Thank you, Scott. Now, Chris, switching to a region from the global theme, let's talk a bit about Europe. And where do you see Europe heading politically and economically in the year ahead? When you were on this panel a few years ago, you commented that there needed to be important changes in Europe, and the social welfare reforms that were needed had been postponed and postponed. We know that they have all been dealt with completely adequately in the last 2 years. What is your view today?
Well, I still think that there's going to have to be fundamental social reform. I think one of the things that's interesting, as someone who's not actually in the financial community, but obviously tied up within it, is that you see the fast-acting, rational, logical financial markets crashing into, decades, if not centuries, of history and culture. And there's a real clash here because I think particularly financial markets have been used to companies as debtors, but not necessarily countries. If a debtor company has a problem, put it into Chapter 11, let's restructure this thing, let's move out of it. If you've got countries, we've had since the Second World War, the social underpinnings of our economy have also been the underpinnings of what has led to peace for the longest period of time in Europe. There are huge emotional attachments to the system. There's been a very strong protective culture in Europe. You don't throw people out of work. If the economy goes south, we have stabilizers that are built in. So suddenly, what we've seen, and this is not unlike what we're seeing in the US, by the way. I mean, I personally don't think on either side of the Atlantic we can be that comfortable. You've got significant structural changes occurring in terms of aging populations, in terms of the rise of chronic disease, which are driving up healthcare costs everywhere. The US is only slightly ahead of Europe in the sense that it doesn't hit the wall until a few years later in terms of Medicare, and Social Security a little further out. But those underlying trends have made our model unsustainable. And I think that's where we're really up against it, that in order to restructure, France today, for instance, spends 55% of its economy through government expenditure. Well, if we're going to withdraw that, we're touching these basic social systems that have protected the population. Well, people aren't just going to walk away from that from one day to another. I'd like to quote Frida Lewis Hall's husband, who mentioned in an innovation forum earlier this morning that people don't change because they see the light. People change because they feel the heat. And this is where we are starting to get to in Europe. But I think it has to get a little hotter yet before we will really see it. Now, we have seen some. Germany moved there almost 7, 8 years ago. France has started. We increased our retirement rate from 60 to 62. I think that's going to have to go a lot further along. You see the riots that are occurring in Greece because of the cutback in government programs. So I think there's going to be a mix of more heat and some acceptance of change, but it's going to take some time. I think in that period, we stay with uncertainty, we stay with low growth, and ultimately I think this is where Scott's right. You know, ultimately some of this transfer from creditors to debtors is also ultimately going to be part of the solution.
Thanks, Chris. Now, to put a slightly rosier glow on the discussion, since we noticed some people taking their vodka out and listening to us, Eike, how do you? Let's start with the story of Brazil, and specifically, where do you see it's trending in the next 2 to 3 years?
Okay. President Lula, in his 8-year tenure, managed to bring 35 million Brazilians, Chris, one Canada, into the middle class in 8 years. So today, Brazil, a country of 192 million Brazilians, have 100 million people in the middle class, and another 50 million to go by 2020. So it's a very nice, rosy scenario, as you said. Now, I think most people do not realize, because Brazil many times is put in the category of the banana republics, but we know Brazil is today already the 6th largest economy in the world, soon to pass France. Chris, again, you again. Hopefully by 2015, if the euro devalues a little bit. And internal demand-driven economy, only 5% of GDP are mortgages, so totally unleveraged. Again, totally opposite of Europe and America, which is obviously the base, you know, for you to have pent-up demand. So I see tremendous 20-year, this is a 20-year growth scenario. And Brazil is welcoming foreign investment. I think, can I see my Dilma slide, which is very important, which actually is a statement. You know, many investors and thought that Brazil would nationalize slowly the oil industry through Petrobras. And you know, this picture, this happened on Thursday when President Dilma came to visit my superport, a port for Brazil. We're building the largest port complex in the world today, which will be smaller than Shanghai. You know, Chinese build very big things, as you know. But you know, slightly smaller than Rotterdam. And she came to visit the port, and at the same time we celebrated, you know, Brazil, OGX's, which is a private owned listed company, our first oil. We beat the record. You know, we put this production in, from the first well drilled into production in 2 years and 4 months for offshore oil, which, you know, dealing offshore is always a major undertaking. And you know, here you have the proof that not only is she supporting the private sector, accepting that the private sector steps into the oil production, but also giving the international community a very clear message. Come to Brazil because the private sector investment is welcome to be active in the oil industry. And you know, just an example what happened recently in our continent, besides what my friend north of Brazil, you know, Chavez, likes to do with in terms of nationalizing assets, our southern neighbor did exactly the same. So Brazil is different, and that picture really illustrates, tells the whole story.
I knew you would be pessimistic, so to keep the... Xi-Qing, where do you see Asia for the next few years in terms of the current trends, and where do you see the growth and development coming?
Well, like many of your slides show, that Asia is going to continue to grow as part of the emerging market. But that would probably have some sort of a shift among the Asian countries rather than, you know, changing the present trend that emerging market is going up and China has been going up, and people say, well, what if China comes down? We have come down with our growth prospect this year by 1 full percentage point. And then people say, well, that will probably be the benefit of the European and Americans, but we don't certainly believe that. Because the other Asian countries, then China, excluding Japan, would continue to grow. And our whatever we lose in terms of exporting to the United States and to Europe is going to be the gain of other Asian countries. And if you look at overall demographics and overall political and economic situation, it's not going to be anything anytime soon when the whole trend revert. And with our new government coming in, China's economy is probably going to go through a even more, I would say, more healthy direction, simply because over the past few years we have been going with a net breaking speed, and that has been making us nervous. Therefore, the fact that we come down is actually a very good sign for most of the economies in China, and we believe that given time, it's going to be still going to be growing fast and much more healthily. That's what I have.
All right. Now, Barry, I count on you to disagree
With what?
with anything.
No,
Okay.
so, well, I'll start with you then.
Why should this be different than our normal conversation?
The U.S. is not, I don't think you can count on the U.S. for steady growth right now. I mean, you can't, the economy has to be growing when you're spending $1.5 trillion more than you're taking in. And the trends are clear. The states, municipalities, the federal government is actually shedding jobs, and it's creating a bit of a headwind for private sector, which is actually increasing employment. Better numbers than it actually looks like on the surface. You see it week after week. And if you think we're divorced from Europe, it's very interesting. When Bernanke lowered rates here, and the Treasury lowered rates, they were helping really the banking sector. You can invest in anything and earn a spread in the U.S. banking system and recapitalize the banks over time. So they let you borrow from the government and still do at 0%. You could buy RMBS, you could buy CMBS, you could buy sovereign, you could buy our debt, and banks recapitalized over time. In Europe, they never had that cost basis. They never had those deposits. So all the banks were gigantic and relied on external funding to create the spread between what they borrow at and what they lent at. And so relying on foreign capital, the markets adjusted their cost of capital to reflect their balance sheets, and they can't earn their way out of this issue. They couldn't borrow at 0 and lend at 5 and recapitalize over time. So instead, in December, they came up with this really nifty solution, the LTRO. And the LTRO, which is the Long-Term Restructuring Act, was letting all of a sudden the banks borrow. If you give them their assets, they let you borrow at 1%. For the first time in the European crisis, they stabilized the liability side of the balance sheet of the European banking system. But what did they do with the money? Instead of going in and buying, investing in their economies, they actually went out and bought their sovereign debt. And by doing so, the Spanish banks basically bought the debt of Spain, and the Italian banks bought the debt that has to be rolled over. And they didn't really solve anything, which is dawning on the markets right now. In fact, arguably, they may have made it worse because you've solved debt with more debt. And you see the French banks withdrawing to France. You see the German banks withdrawing to Germany. You see the Spanish banks, instead of lending offshore, are now financing the crisis of Spain. And at some point, they're going to run out of money here. And the point is the U.S. also relies on external financing, just like the European guys. We're just behind them. And we have a bigger economy with a reserve currency. We get to do this for longer, but unless we cure the structural issues that Europe has, we're going to have the same issue. And when we beat up the Chinese, I mean, I'm a real estate guy. The first thing you learn in real estate is never beat up your banker, right? So, I mean, we need you guys. And if you want the Chinese to consume so aggressively, God forbid they stop exporting to us and don't have the need to buy recycle their cash in our deficits. So we have time to get it right, but we won't have forever to get it right. And the Chinese are rapidly working to create domestic consumption, which would allow them to alleviate their need of financing our deficit forever because they don't like what we're doing. They don't like, I had a Chinese gal who's quite senior in a bank say to me, you looked at us and said we were doing legitimate counterfeiting, and you weren't happy about it. So I don't know what you think about that, but I think we're living on borrowed debt, borrowed time, and I think our friends in China, who have been great trading partners and have helped us enjoy maybe a standard of living we probably shouldn't have right now. I mean, I see the world between the developed and as Scott said, he started out, we're either going to do this gently with ripples or a giant earthquake. And I think the earthquake is the adjustment between living standards between the developed world and the emerging markets. And we're going to try to muddle our way through this, but there's never been a crisis of leadership on a global scale like you see today, and with all these elections coming up. It certainly is an interesting world. And it keeps you from being a full pedal to the throttle because you're worried. I just came from a conference last week that I actually just listened to. And everyone at this conference felt that it was inevitable that we would have another major earthquake, another shake in the next 4 years to the world's financial systems. And I think we can fix it, but we're going to need some positive leadership in the world.
Chris, I'll let you, and then Eike, I'd like to.
Yeah, I think Barry just said a word that was really important, which is leadership. If we'd have been here in 1995, we'd have all been moaning and groaning about yet another terrible year in Latin America. We recently announced some quarterly results where, one of the strong currencies against the euro was the Brazilian real. I mean, who'd have thought? And what really changed? Well, right now what we see in the U.S. and Europe is the wrong debate. We're seeing a debate between austerity and growth, which I don't think is the right debate. The debate is, what's the role of the state in an economy, and what's the role of the private sector? And there are those who want to get rid of austerity programs and go for growth programs. But all that means is we don't really want to shrink the role of the state yet. And we don't really want to incent the private sector yet. What really happened in Brazil was that finally there was responsible fiscal leadership that occurred. And as Eike was saying the other day, that has been succeeded now with 3 successive presidents. And just the slide that he showed up said, and actually the Brazilian government is open for business. We're not about to privatize the petroleum industry. We welcome investment. Now, if you contrast Brazil to Argentina, for example, where clearly, you got geographic proximity, but the difference is you haven't had the same amount of leadership. And that, I think, is really the debate we really have to have. It's not about austerity or growth. We need growth, but we also need that coupled with responsible fiscal leadership in our government.
You need a plan.
Absolutely.
You need a business plan.
Yeah.
Can I ask Eike a question? You want us to speak?
You can
about
ask Eike the question. Sure, go ahead.
So, because we're investors in Brazil and we're in India and other countries, how much of do you think the education issues in Brazil is a deficit to the country, and what are they going to do to fix that? And how focused is the government on education?
Well, yes, important question. We are running, again, my rosy glasses, which in reality it's what's happening in Brazil. We have right now 5.5%, 6% unemployment. So yes, we have potential inflation pressures because of higher salaries. And my group, we're helping the government, and so are other big Brazilian corporations. We are preparing, in the next 2 years, we're preparing 24,000 Brazilian technicians to work in our different operations. So Brazil is tackling it. We're using very much the German model, to build technical schools. Obviously, we need a lot of engineers, but you need technicians to basically build Brazil. So the almost full employment rate, as you can see here, is the reflection of basically the creation of 2 million jobs a year. And the world I see is the world of the southern hemisphere. That if you add up all the countries in South America, including Brazil, you look at Africa, you go to India, China, and the big countries around like Indonesia, this part of the world is creating 20 million jobs a year. So these people need a lot of Brazil does. And if you pick 6 of Brazil's most important commodities, which is meat, sugar, coffee that you're all drinking for sure. Most people don't know, but Brazil produces 40% of the world's coffee. We should create an OPEC of coffee, actually. It would be a good idea.
Great idea.
Yeah, increase the price for us. That's what they do, no? It's a good idea.
We're missing
If you add,
You're shifting our ground again.
yeah, I'm sorry, yes. Yeah. If you add the oil, the Brazilian oil story is $1 trillion story, you know? So we're talking about tapping into 100 billion barrels of oil between shallow waters and deep waters. And you know, the energy sector really moves the needle, big time. So the world I'm seeing is in Brazil. Many of you were probably surprised that we did grow 7.5% in 2009. Yeah. Last year we grew 2.7 due to the fact that the federal government wanted to control inflation. Now, what did they do? They used standard monetary policies and increased the rates to 12%. 12%. So the consumer at the bottom had an increase in his cost at 20%. Listen, my amigos, you stop any economy of this world, you know, if you raise interest at that rates. Banks in Brazil make 20%, 25% on equity. It's a scandal. I mean, I should actually walk into banking also. But, and the government, the federal government is trying to work on it by using the state banks to reduce the rates. 10% a month for credits, you know, on credit cards. So it's you know, maybe you should take advantage of it. So I really live in a rosy, I live in a rosy environment, you know, considering the 20 million jobs that are being created. China's latest number for the quarter, they have had again record steel production, for which they need lots of Brazilian iron ore. Iron ore prices are $150 a ton. The Chinese, you know, iron ore mines used to have 46% grade in situ. They're now down to 15%. So they need Brazilian iron ore. So you know, it's a necessity. And Brazil is so goddamn competitive in the commodities, in the 6 commodities that we produce, that only this group of commodities by the end of the decade, so by 2020, will help Brazil double its exports. Just to give you an idea of the importance of besides, you know, industrial products, but, you know, it's very difficult to compete with China in obviously labor cost. And, but Brazil has created a national content rule. So if you want to participate in Brazil's oil boom, you have to comply with a 70% national content rule that is provoking, you know, GEs and all the big players in the world that are active in the oil arena, National Oil Varco, all the names you know, to move to Brazil and produce it in Brazil. Because it's a lot about job creation and job preservation. So see, that's a very rosy picture, isn't it?
No, perhaps is it a rosy picture, Xi-Qing, if you're someone who's thinking about investing in Brazil from China?
Investing in Brazil? Well, we tried.
I was there first.
Yeah, I got to know Ike a long time ago, but the problem with us at present time is that unlike in some of the emerging market countries, or unlike in some of the other emerging market countries, the Brazilian government sometimes shifts its policy, both in terms of its taxation and in terms of its content requirement, all these things. So when we try to invest there, very often we'll be surprised by the sudden increase of their, say, foreign investment gains. For instance, last year, all of a sudden, they just increased 2 percentage points, and all of a sudden it makes most of your investment unprofitable. So because of that, our people are kind of reluctant in many ways. And also, because we do a lot of direct investment, and we do that in many countries, and we were quite gung-ho about investing in Brazil, and I went to Brazil several times during that period of time, and many of our teams were sitting there. Have to remember, it takes about 20 hours just in the air for us to get to Brazil. But after that, we found that many policies started to change. and making it a little more expensive for us. And of course, Brazil itself is more expensive than China, that we recognize, and you have a 2.5 times the per capita GDP and all that, but your labor force there is a lot more expensive than the Chinese. And we're hoping to help the Brazilian government to set up your high-speed railway for the Olympics. But then after we got in and we started studying it, and then the government said, okay, no Chinese workers, no Chinese engineers, you have to hire all Brazilians. And then we did the calculation, we found the cost to be at least double from the original estimation. So, understand that. Most countries will have certain requirement as to, how many of your workers to be brought in. But we still were reflecting over the fact that over 100 years ago, this country brought in a lot of Chinese workers, built your railroad. But after that, you drove after all of them, and because you thought the Chinese would ruin your job market. But for us, as a sovereign wealth fund, we're a passive investor. Everywhere we go, we typically only invest in not more than 10-15% of the thing. And if it's really required, it's really very much desired by the investee company, and we increase our percentage. But typically we'll say, okay, we don't vote, we don't intend to change the management. We don't do anything in that regard. So we should be an ideal investor. But in many countries, Brazil and Argentina included, very often they are suspicious of the Chinese intent. That, of course, will sometimes create some problems for us. But overall, we have had quite a few investment there, including some investment in Eike's company, including investment in some financial sector institutions there. But we're fully aware of the obstacles. We hope to gradually overcome those things.
Yeah, but Brazil has a very important industry base. We produce aircraft. You use them here in the U.S., Embraer. So we have a massive skilled workforce. 192 million Brazilians. Brazil has the privilege, say today, to maybe similar to Canada, to live from its resources in a big time, and very difficult to compete, obviously, in the world markets with Chinese quality products. The other day, we went to Terry Goh from Foxconn, assembles 80% of Apple's equipment. I mean, impossible to compete. Quality.
In our sweatshops?
Yeah, well, you said it. We don't, no sweatshops in Brazil. In Brazil, this is what you said. You see,
well these jobs we're paying our workers better now.
Yeah, okay. But see, I as a new business leader in Brazil, would never accept this type of condition. So we're preserving Brazilian jobs, and the oil is spurring a gigantic new naval industry. Most people don't know, but in the 80s, we used to be the second largest shipbuilder in the world, because we already back then used to ship mountains of iron ore, mountains of soya to the world. And that was collapsed because of liberal policies, let's buy wherever it's cheaper. Now, with the oil story that is so big, Brazil, I think very cleverly, President Lula, in 2002, decided this country is going to build the naval industry back to its old days. And Brazil's oil arena is the largest offshore arena in the world. So why not, give us a lead time of at least 5 years, mandate us businessmen to bring the best technology in the world. So that's what we're doing in the group. We're partners with IBM. We brought Hyundai. These fifth generation shipyards are really Korean and Singaporean. They came to Brazil. They are partners with 20%. Because Brazilian has great entrepreneurs, and we're capable of doing it. So we're using the strength of the natural wealth of our country that was really built, in the last 30, 40 years through these great government-controlled structures like Petrobras and Vale and iron ore, the Embraer that was created. And so you have lots of talent, manpower and talent, and incredible resources, maybe resources that you Americans had at the turn of the century. That's why Brazil is really so rosy.
Well, let's say something positive about the U.S. Okay, so just to come back to hometown, if the government would back away, we have an enormous resource in natural gas, and we could liquefy it. We could run our cars. And T-Bone Pickens is here. I can't imagine why Congress hasn't made the trucks run on gas yet. I mean, but we have. And the natural gas, the energy revolution in the States is real, and it is subsidizing consumers, and it is allowing them to spend more. We obviously have a ridiculous interest rate policy that's also helping consumers. Can I go to those slides for a sec, 38 and 39? Because I can't leave here without this.
Absolutely.
This is it's 39.
38
sorry,
and 39.
39. So on the other hand, that was my one positive note. We also are, I have to say, there's another positive note, because I just was up in Silicon Valley, and we are an extraordinary creative entrepreneurial nation, and it is an extraordinary base of entrepreneurs that can grow companies. Those four companies, the four horsemen, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Apple, are $1 trillion+ in market cap and didn't exist 15 years ago. So left to our creative devices, we will find ways to make jobs and create great commerce and industry. But I do think, go to 39 for a second, that we are making maybe the biggest mistake of my life. Is it going to come up here? And no, go to the other one, 39. 39 first. Which is, so the blue line is interest expense on federal debt, and the red line is interest rates. So our total interest bill, which is not paid 100% to our domestic holders, is going to hit $500 billion. And if you look at that's against an interest rate of an average interest rate around 2.5%. So if you were a banker or you were running any of Ike's companies or Sanofi, and you're faced with long-term liabilities, entitlements, Medicare spending, Social Security, what would you do faced with that, with the opportunity to refinance your debt at the lowest interest rates of my life? You do the next slide, right? You do Operation Twist. Go to 40, slide 40, please. And you finance the entire deficit at the short end of the curve, which is the greatest mismatch in hedge fund history. I mean, they would shut down a hedge fund and all the banks if they financed their long-term liabilities at the short end of the curve. Now, this is financial suicide. This is financial nitroglycerin. And if you keep doing this, and we don't need 0% interest rates on the short end of the curve. I think David Einhorn just gave a speech about this, and I 100% agree. I've been saying it for 2 years. They need to raise short rates in the United States to 1 or 2%. Any sophisticated long-term manager doesn't do any capital investment off the short end of the curve. We look at 5-year treasuries and 10-year treasuries. We look at our swaps, and we make investments for long-term. The short end of the curve is basically Bernanke's way of getting Obama elected again. I mean, he basically put a put under the stock market. Everyone has to go out and buy stocks because there's nowhere else to put cash. It's liquid. The market goes up, and Obama's approval ratings are going up and down with the S&P 500. So his campaign chairman apparently appears to be Bernanke, and it's not really very funny, actually, at the end of the day, because there's really not a logical reason. It hasn't helped the housing market. In fact, knowing that rates won't go up till 2014, you don't have to rush and get a house. It doesn't spur capital investment because you don't have to make an investment thinking rates are going to go up tomorrow. I got to lock in my long-term rates. It isn't. For me as a businessman, it means we're waiting for QE4 now, right? We're saying these are extreme times. Hold on to your cash because it's a weird world. The government is subsidizing interest rates to try to get the economy going, and it hasn't worked. Does anyone notice? It's not working.
Well,
so
Barry, I don't want to interrupt.
No, go ahead. I mean, I think it's a. I'd like to know what you think. I mean, I think this is one of the greatest mistakes. This makes the Greenspan housing bubble look like the warm-up act.
Well, if you go to slide 49 to follow on to Barry's point.
I didn't know you had a follow-on slide. I'm very excited.
I got yours ahead of time.
I only have 2 slides. That's it.
You can see that what you're saying is true, and what you were talking about with the low interest rates and the lack of consumption has led to a collapse in the velocity of money.
Right.
And this collapse of the velocity of money, given Dr. Bernanke's background, is to print more money to offset its decline, because that was the mistake of the Great Depression, not doing that. But the consequence, I think, and I'm in your camp, is slide 52, which is this commitment to this easy monetary policy is basically setting us up to be behind the curve. Matter of fact, using the Fed's own models, which includes the Taylor rule, we should already be thinking about, if not acting on, raising interest rates. And the commitment through 2014, using the Fed's central tendency estimates, shows that they overtly are lagging policy in order to save housing in the economy.
But it penalizes savers, it penalizes older America, it creates the wrong economic behavior, it doesn't induce foreign capital to buy our treasuries. I mean, I was with one of the larger sovereign wealth funds, not this one, and in Asia, and they said, we have enough of your treasuries, we'll buy something else now. And so in general, I mean, I think it's not, but the biggest issue is banks have $1 trillion of cash, companies have $1.5 trillion, $3 trillion of cash.
Huge.
The more cash we've ever had. Why? It's because we were all waiting for that shoe to drop. We're waiting for that. We were worried about the volatility of the world climate. We're doing nothing to solve it, so we're saving and we're holding on to our cash. It's creating the opposite behavioral pattern that the Fed should want.
Well, Xi-Qing, listening to this, are you ready to advise your government to go short the dollar and long the real?
Wow.
Well, we don't advise. The fact that we were established 4.5 years ago is, on the one hand, the realization that this country and many of these other Western countries have been really spending their way out of their savings, and this is going on for the past 20, 30, 40 years, rather than a sudden new trend. And another pressure, of course, was from your countries, where when people ask me in this country why you all of a sudden set up the sovereign wealth fund, looking as if you want to come over and take over our things, I said, look, this is under pressure of your government. 5, 6 years ago, we were constantly being told by the U.S. government and the European governments that we have saved too much money, have accumulated too much foreign currency, and you guys are just big savers, which is not good for yourself. You should spend some money in our country. So we started spending money in your country by establishing a company like ourselves and investing in your country. But because of this general imbalance of your spending and borrowing patterns, we realized from day one that we should not really spend all our money buying your debt, because we already had too much in your debt. So our asset allocation is very different from many of our counterparties in other countries, where we have a big chunk in direct investment in emerging markets, because we know that if we buy these government bonds, then eventually the governments are not going to be able to pay for it, even though you're all rated AAA or things like that. But historically, we study history. We Chinese love to study history, and we look at the past 1,500 years of history. Government bonds are the worst credit product in history. So why should we buy?
Eike, why do you own so? Why do you own so many?
Ooh.
Not our company. Or our government has no. This is a relatively short period of time when we all of a sudden accumulated over $3 trillion for this thing, simply because all your industries all of a sudden started to switch to China and started investing there and buying things from China. That's a very short period of time if you think about it. Now people start to realize in both ways. Some of the the Chinese labor cost is rising rapidly. I was sort of making a joke about the sweatshops, but we're no longer sweatshops simply because our workers now, with full awareness of this, and they said, no, we demand more salary. And we all, in the major cities, people with kids, we all hire nannies from the countryside. Only 10 years ago, the cost of hiring a nanny was about 10% of what we have today. So the salary increases 10 times over only 10 years' time. It's amazing how fast the labor costs are rising. That's why many of the U.S. industries start to shift their production back to this country. So now, in our country, when we start investing our money in foreign countries, we look at the situation, we see two general general trends that we don't like. One is the debt equity ratio in your countries. Two, the way talents go. This started about 30 years ago when we look at it. At the time when I was in this country, all the talents, all the best, the brightest and smartest go to financial industry instead of going to manufacturing, science, and technology. It's true that today the U.S. is still the most creative, the most dynamic economy, and your educational system still produces creativity, but not engineers, that we know. So when you actually look at it, and you look at the number differential in China, where we produce quite a few million engineers every year, it's true that our educational system is so much concentrated on rote learning, committing to memory, and also our age-old policy of having central controls, paternalistic way of telling people what to do. People say, oh, your educational system is so bad and you can't produce enough people with good thinking. That's probably true, but you look at the trend. We have a huge base of a lot of people. And right now, most of the middle-class parents are trying to send their kids to this country to study. But if you continue this trend, I know a lot of Chinese kids who come to this country to study physics, mathematics, engineering, but in the middle of it, when they are 2 years into their PhD, they say, I'm not going to do that. So they switch back to MBAs, law schools, and this is just a culture. That trend is starting to do the change in China as well. Many Chinese universities which never had any business schools now start to have business schools, start to have law schools. I'm a huge advocate not to have that. I keep telling our government, stop doing that. We don't, B schools are nonsense. With no due respect for these things. Maybe when you get into the position of CEO, you want to go back to schools studying that, but really not to start with that. So when you see that, you have that fear. That's why we do more in direct investment, in actual companies, in the real thing, rather than in financial products.
But we have a 600 billion current account deficit, 300 billion in oil, and 300 billion in trade to China. I shouldn't say this, but I am known for saying crazy things. But let me think if I should say this or not. Give me a second. Well, you're the second largest economy in the world, and yet you're the only major country with a fixed currency, and now you have a band. And
not really fixed, floating.
It's now semi-floating. So we wouldn't have been able to seduce ourselves or on all the consumption we did and that led to our great financial recession had your currency be floating, and you fed off the American predilection to consume beyond our means, buying our debt, keeping rates low. And normally, if that currency had been floating, your goods would have gone up in Walmart. We wouldn't have been able to afford it. Our interest rates would have risen. We wouldn't have had a housing crisis the way we did. I know I'm sort of making excuses for us. We're not very good at managing our balance sheets. But it's very hard to have a global economy with one major player with a fixed currency. And yet, and I know the politicians, and you're going to do it on your time, and you have, as you mentioned, 1,500-year horizons. But it's... Oh boy.
Barry, I think I'm a gardener. Barry, I think I'm going
to be a housekeeper in my next career.
Yeah.
Look, if our rates are really fixed, the pictures are going to be totally different. Remember, only 3 years ago, the exchange rate was 8.3 to 1. Yeah. Right today, what? 6.2.
6.2.
Our currency has appreciated against the dollar for more than 30% now.
Yeah, and to be fair, you have inflation higher than you have negative I mean, the currency's been eroded a little bit by inflation too, theoretically.
Right, much of that. So recently, when we widened the tunnel, for our currency to
Which was
float,
big.
All of a sudden it starts to drop rather than going up. It's a clear sign that most of the people there, we have a lot of what we call offshore the RMB trading places now, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in London, all these places, and people start trading on these things. These are free market. It's not rigged. The Chinese government cannot go, powerful as they are, they can't really go to those places to try to rig the exchange rate. So, I think it's a weak argument that people say, oh, it's because you're all fixed, so therefore we have our problems. There are many problems. We have our problems for sure, but not the.
And we have our problems too.
I want to. Can I shift the gear a little?
Well, I was going to. Ike wanted to shift one, but because we're almost out of time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go down the line. You're each going to get a chance to shift the gear for 1 minute, okay? And we do things. Ike?
Okay, let me tell you a mega reason why you should be extremely proud and positive about America. If I'm not wrong, the S&P 500 companies is probably if you look at the size of it, it's roughly the second largest economy of the world. It's a $7 trillion machine. Your companies are active in Brazil. Without the Caterpillars, the Halliburtons, GE, all your great American companies, I would not be able to produce oil in my country. So 60% of the profits of your great S&P 500 companies are made in emerging markets. So we are a gigantic driving force. And when you come to Brazil, you integrate with Brazilians, you hire Brazilians. So that's what the Chinese cannot do. You cannot go there and, bring Chinese. Nobody. You Americans the way you integrate into different societies is absolutely phenomenal. So we thrive on the quality of your products, on your competence. And recently Juma just announced Brazil will be giving 100,000 scholarships for Brazilians to come to study in your wonderful educational universities, or on your great universities. So these are real assets that you have. Thank you.
I may not short the dollar as quickly as Xi-Qing, what keeps you up at night?
Sorry, is that again?
What keeps you awake at night? What do you worry about?
I always have very good sleep.
All right, Scott.
No, listen, joking, but we have our major problems, despite of the criticism that we have right now, just for argument's sake. But the Chinese economy has a lot of longer-term issues, as I said, alluded to earlier about our educational system, or our system, doesn't really encourage free thinking and creativity and all that. But that's not just for the present government. It's been that way for 2,000 years. Our educational system was always that way. That's why when you look at the scores, the Chinese always test the best in math, in physics, in these things. But when it comes to creativity, comes to free thinking, comes to, really sort of values that you guys here in this country would value, that we have a problem. But that's changing as well. If you look at a new generation of people, if you look at the younger people, who not only those people who come to this country, but many of the kids that are in China, everyone, you go everywhere, including very small kids, everyone is having a cell phone, they get on the web and they work on these things. But that we eventually need to address. And right now, the fact that most of the middle-class parents still want to send their kids abroad is a huge manifestation that we need to reform on that regard. And another problem that we have is that the trend of reform started about 35 years ago, somewhat slowed down over the past few years simply because the state economy has become so strong and it becomes, very much of a state monopoly and oligopoly in many different industries, that the private enterprise started to be squeezed out. And that, again, put another dampening effect on the creativity, on the initiative of the smaller enterprises, of the private initiatives. And that I'm sure our government's aware of that, and they are trying to reverse that trend and go on with the reform so that people can value much more on the creativity, on the private entrepreneurship rather than big state enterprises. You know, 10 years ago, the percentage of GDP produced by the state sector was down to about 30%. But today, it's back to over 50%. And that, many people in China will say, oh, that's great, because the state now can have more money to compensate on the poorer people and on the lack of social security and all that. But that very often would give the government almost too much power to do things that they want. So I think that's being debated, and I'm sure our next government is going to, probably change course in that regard. And another problem that we have is that the overall personnel system is still such that many of the leadership in all the major state enterprises are still decided on
Or to
very
take
much
shopping.
of the
Sorry.
on the very much on the political side rather than on purely market-oriented merit-based system. So we are addressing these issues, once that's changed, then things will be a lot better. But before that, we're still going to be, despite the trend that we're going, we're still going to be having problems.
Bota o Think Shopping na tela, pode ser? Rapidinho, rapidinho. Tá na hora. What's it? You see that one?
All right. I'll give you a Chinese passport.
Thank you very much.
As long as you pay taxes there. Scott, we're going to give you a minute for whatever you'd like to change gears to, or whatever's worrying you right now.
Well, you were asking about worries, and what's keeping me up at night is regret related to how many years I spent in business school.
If you'd only been able to pass the courses.
I wish I would have attended the classes. It could have been interesting. But the thing that I'm really, I thought of the comment Herbert Hoover made in 1932 after he lost the election. And when he was asked about losing the election, he said, if we had recognized how severe the problem was, we could have taken the steps to fix it. The issue I'm most concerned about is the policymakers in the world don't seem to recognize what's happening here. And because they don't recognize what's happening, they're retreating into policies that ultimately could lead to major problems down the road. And I could talk about those, but for brevity, I'll just leave that go. But the thing that I would say is that it's my hope that they will wake up and they will take the appropriate action before faced with crisis, and that in the process of this, we would understand that nations like China are a friend and should be warmly embraced, and the Europeans are there to work with, not to be a competitive interest. I perhaps am being too optimistic about the fate of the policymakers, but that's what's keeping me awake.
Barry, a minute for you.
All right, I'd say there's something about the will of a nation which is probably underrated at the end of the day. And I think Americans have two huge things going for them. One is we are naturally an optimistic people. We still think tomorrow is better than today and will be better. I still think that's intact. And I think as an optimistic nation, coupled with a very short-term memory, we go from weekend to weekend and focus on this Super Bowl or that baseball team or Linsanity. That's a good thing. We don't harbor generations of ill will. Our parents, my parents were, well, my mom was born here, but my dad was an immigrant from Europe. And we are a nation that left to our own devices, we will do great. And I think what we're all looking for is what we all desperately need is significant leadership, because the world will wait for us. We're too important. We talk about the U.S., we are still the dominant economy in the world by 1,000,000 miles, and the rest of the world, particularly I'm struck as I travel, how much of the world is looking for us for leadership. They want us to win. They want us to survive. We have this democratic ideal. We are about free speech. They want us to be the light on the hill, and that's what they're missing from us today.
And Chris, you get to wrap up.
So I'd like to wrap up by looking towards the future. I mean, Eike will tell you that there's huge value in the ground. You know, my business is based on people walking on the ground. And you know, if you look at all of our regions, we've all been through worse times and have come out through successfully. I don't think the world economic order is cast in stone. I think if I look at my production costs and my plants in Brazil, they are no longer competitive compared to the rest of Latin America. I think as I look at rising healthcare costs and other costs in China, I think there's going to be a need for both China and Brazil to at some point think about where's the next generation of growth going to come from. My personal view, it's going to come through innovation. Those who have the smartest people win. And you need to start thinking about who's going to invest not only in education, but who is able to harness that through investments in research and being able to provide the next generation of goods and services that really create value. Right now, I think any of our regions could win. Today, I would say the US is in a leadership role. If you look at where are the new medicines coming out from, where are the iPhones coming from, it's the United States. But equally, there's significant investment in Europe that's going on. China is spending a huge amount, as we saw, on generating more PhDs in science and mathematics. I think Brazil actually has a lot of way to go to actually get to be a research-based economy. So whatever we happen to be looking at for whatever is going on today, I think it has been useful to look back 1,500 years, but I think it is also useful to look forward, what's going to happen over the next 10 years? And nobody has won the next 10 years yet, and I think every region, especially if you're going to bet on innovation, has an opportunity to win.
Great way to end. Thank you, panelists, very much.